Hey, would you like to see an honest review of 8Bitdo's fresh on shelves brand spanking new so-called Ultimate controller? And I emphasize honest there because the few pre-release bits of coverage and reviews I've seen about this thing from people who have been given this from 8Bitdo or are working with them or are directly sponsored by them, well, let's just say my spider sense started to tingle because I don't normally look at reviews before I am intending to review something, so my review isn't colored by their opinion. So I tested this, then I looked at what other people were saying about it, and I went, hang on a second. You're missing out on a few things there. Why aren't you mentioning this? Why aren't you mentioning this? Why aren't you mentioning this? Why are you saying that about this? It clearly does no. Suspicious. Now, I'm not going to name any names. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus. I don't want to start any of that tedious, petty internet drama crap because, who has time for that, really? But yeah, so far with almost universal praise and some stuff they've chosen for some reason to completely overlook or not mention at all, it felt a little sus. So I'm going to do a thing I don't normally do and do that passive aggressive thing and call this an honest review, which is kind of a little dog whistle that YouTubers love to use sometimes for certain types of reviews where they want to imply that other people aren't being honest about it. And the only way you're going to get an honest review is by watching my content, because I'm the only one who's going to give you the truth. And to be fair, for, coming up on 2 decades, really, I've built a reputation for zero bullshit in my reviews and whatnot. So if you're going to come somewhere honest, you got to come to Blunty, right? Hello again, I am Blunty. Thank you for sitting through that intro. Let's get to the meat of it, shall we? So, let's see about this 8Bitdo Ultimate Bluetooth controller. Is it just the ultimate 8Bitdo themselves are capable of making, or is it legitimately worthy of such a hyperbolic name to be the ultimate controller out there in the universe of controllers? Now, the unboxing is an unremarkable experience. Controller, booklet, dock, and cable. The dock is actually quite nice. More on this later, but it's an elegant design, smooth, slick, sort of follows the lines and flow of the controller itself. Looks nice when it sits in there. It is a bit too light, I feel. It sort of slides around on the desk a little bit, and with a cubby hole for a USB wireless receiver on the bottom. And that has a very special little trick that I'll tell you more about later in this review, but that's more than just a cubby hole. Now, like I mentioned, and as you can clearly see, it's a Nintendo Switch layout, ABXY reversed to Xbox, in other words, and there's 2 different problems with that I'll get to later. It has 2 programmable back paddles, and it connects natively to the Nintendo Switch's Bluetooth, just like any other, first-party Nintendo controller does. So that USB wireless connector is only for PC use. And with the flick of a switch on the back of the controller, you can move between platforms easily, no resync required. So that's neat. Size-wise, it's close to Nintendo's own Pro Controller, and it feels ever so slightly lighter in hand. And here you can see it compared to my current favourite third-party Switch controller, the Power A Fusion Pro. I'll come back to this comparison later too, as there's a couple of very important things to compare between them. And just for reference, the PlayStation 5 controller, the lowest of my personal preferences when it comes to controllers. So let's just go straight to some actual gameplay use while we have a chat about some important stuff that this controller does and does not do. There are 3 flagship features for this controller in my view. The first is the thumbsticks. They use what's called a Hall effect sensor. Now, for decades, thumbsticks have used potentiometers, electronics that very basically are just variable resistors. 2 components make physical contact with each other, and scraping one along the other changes the electrical resistance. Measuring this tells the PC or console or whatever what position the stick is in, how far it's moved in either direction, basically. And the joystick uses one for vertical and one for horizontal. It's very basic, very simple technology, and it's very old technology too. It's been around for much longer than most of you have been alive. But it has been around that long because it is mostly quite reliable, but it is physical and mechanical in nature, which means they do wear out over time. And as a lot of PlayStation and Nintendo users in particular have found in more recent years, poorly engineered ones can lead to severe issues with what we call drift. where even though the stick is centered, the device thinks it's being tilted, leading to erroneous inputs in the game, resulting in anything from annoyance and inconvenience to making the controller utterly, practically useless. Hall effect sensors also use two devices working in tandem to measure vertical and horizontal tilt, but it does it without any mechanical contact by measuring a change in magnetic flux. It is slightly more difficult to explain this to a non-electronics dork, but basically it moves little magnets around and a sensor can tell how far and in what direction that magnet has moved. And as it makes no direct mechanical contact, this type of sensor does not wear out, degrade, or change output over time in the same way a potentiometer does. In simplest terms, it's a lot more reliable long term, and it is impossible for it to suffer from drift under usual circumstances. It is not fair to say Hall effect sensors cannot possibly be affected by drift, because they can. It's just much more difficult for them to do that. Because there is a small possibility for the magnets themselves to change their strength over time. If you know anything about permanent magnets, you'll know things like shock or temperature can easily alter a magnet's strength and properties. This can and will result in a loss of accuracy in tracking. But this is a very small likelihood in very extreme edge cases. In all practical terms, a Hall effect sensor can be expected to perform as new, basically, for decades. And because of the nature of Hall effect sensors and how they basically can't ever drift, they don't need a neutral position dead zone as a buffer against that, making them a lot more responsive for very small movements, at least in theory. We'll come back to that in a minute as well. The second flagship feature of this so-called ultimate controller is the fact it, as we saw in the unboxing, has Bluetooth and a 2.4 GHz receiver. Hardly an exclusive feature. Other controllers have had this in the past, including of course some of 8Bitdo's previous controllers. But the way 8Bitdo have implemented it here is extremely nice and friction-free. A small switch on the back instantly takes you from a Bluetooth connection to your Nintendo Switch over to the 8Bitdo USB receiver. It is instant, it is easy, and it is seamless. No fussing, no issues with resyncing, and what's more, you can have two entirely separate profiles set up for each mode. Which, convenient enough, brings us to the last flagship feature, 8Bitdo's software. Unlike pretty much every other third-party controller I've ever used or reviewed, 8Bitdo has a very nice complete software control system for customizing basically every function of the device. Like, of course, the two back paddle buttons. Most other controllers with these kind of back paddles use some kind of shortcut button combo on the controller to program these right on the controller itself. And it's usually a bit clumsy, and you very often need to have the manual handy because it is kind of always kind of very specific sequences to get into it and get it working properly. And speaking personally, I always forget how to program these things, so I always need to Google the manual and go, oh yeah, press this button, then hold this button down for 3 seconds, then you press the button you want to program, then you press the button you want to program it to. All right. The software makes that a lot easier. And the software does work on Windows and mobile devices as well. So you can connect to it over Bluetooth through your mobile device and program it that way if you don't have a practical way to do it on your computer, for say. The software itself is, well, the UI is a little bit clumsy and it's often a little bit sluggish when you go to change modes and things like that, but it is at least very complete, reasonably intuitive, and drills down as fine as to being able to adjust the activation angle of the trigger buttons, adjusting the precision of each stick, modifying the vibration intensity, and even setting up full-on macros. And you can save multiple profiles onto the controller and swap to them at the press of a button there. And, as I alluded to before, you can have separate profiles for when it's connected to the Switch versus when it's connected to its USB receiver. So you can have completely, separate abilities. If you want to adjust the activation feature of the triggers, for example, on Switch versus PC, you can do that and have it remain consistent and have it automatically assign itself when you switch those functions over. It's really quite nice. So, how about the things I don't like about this thing? Well, for a start, these, the palm lobes. They are unusually vertical, and by that I mean the side parts that sit in your hands. It's hard to see on camera, but in your hand they feel very steep compared to regular controllers, and I find this makes my grip a little tighter. My wrists bend more when trying to hold the controller. It sounds like a tiny thing, but comfort-wise it really stands out to me and really does affect long-term playtime fatigue. In my wrists especially, just, there's a little difference in the angle of your wrist when you're holding this thing versus a regular controller, but it adds up over time, and I feel it over time. I don't like it. I did get more used to it. The longer I use this thing, I noticed it a little less acutely, but the fact is, it is simply not as comfortable as my other controllers. Not as comfortable as the Xbox controller, not as comfortable as the Switch Pro controller, not even as comfortable as the PlayStation 5 controller, my least favorite of all the controllers, and certainly not as comfortable, sort of angle-wise, as the Power A controller. That said, the Power A Fusion Pro is significantly heavier and thicker than this controller is, which brings its own sort of issues of comfortability long-term. And I've also had a few issues with the thumbstick on the Power A as well. The left thumbstick in particular, sometimes it drifts a little bit and I have to give it a sort of a little wiggle to make it recenter itself properly. This isn't a wear and tear issue. It's not a standard sort of drifting issue on the pot. It's a manufacturing tolerance issue. And, I can clear it up by just giving it a bit of a wiggle, and it's usually fine for the entire rest of the play session. It's just sometimes when I pick it up, turn it on for the first time, it just weirdly drifts. You have to go and fix it. So not my favorite thing about that controller. But the other issue specific to the 8Bitdo controller and specific to use on the Nintendo Switch is the trigger buttons are analog. The Switch doesn't use analog triggers. They're digital, which is what the Pro controller has, which is what the Joy-Con has, and is indeed what the Power A has. And that means in games, for example, like Monster Hunter, one of my personal favorite games, they feel quite a lot sloppier in use because that game is designed and uses the triggers in a way that it's vastly beneficial to have instant, digital, fast, short throw triggers. It's more responsive that way. And playing the game with these feels significantly sloppier. The advantage, of course, in having analog triggers on this thing is because it is a dual mode controller. So when you're using it on the computer, playing Steam games or whatever, which are usually designed with analog triggers in mind, or you like your racing games and whatnot, where analog triggers really come in vastly beneficial, then you've got them there. So it's a compromise, but it's a weird compromise in my opinion, because this is, it's got the Nintendo Switch layout. It's branded Nintendo Switch right on the box there. So to have that compromise right there, I don't think it's worth it. I would rather they do what Power A did. This also works on PC just as easily as it does on Nintendo Switch, but they kept the analog triggers on there. If you really wanted to call this thing the ultimate controller, you'd have switchable triggers. You'd have a little notch on the side there. We can just change them to short throw, effectively digital triggers, similar to the mod I showed off for the Xbox controllers a month or two back. I'll link to that in the down below if you're interested. Simple mod, but basically lets you go analog or digital-ish with your triggers. Continuing on with the ergonomics, the thumbsticks have noticeably more resistive spring back than the Switch Pro controller, the Xbox controller, or the PlayStation controller. It feels a bit weird and makes extremely fine movement a little bit trickier. There's just a little bit more initial resistive force if you want to make a very fine control adjustment, especially from neutral position. And considering the very fine fidelity you can get from Hall effect sensors, that's one of the benefits, I find that design choice a bit strange as well. You'd think you'd have a very sort of light spring, so if you wanted to make very, very, very small adjustments, especially again from neutral position, a lighter spring would make that a lot more practical. And again, with the Hall effect sensors, you don't have to worry about a dead zone in the middle. You don't have to worry about drift or anything like that. So you could do that quite happily. So going for unusually strong springs, weird choice. The main face buttons feel closer to Xbox than anything else. They're a little bit softer than the Nintendo Switch, a little bit firmer than the PlayStation. They feel pretty good. They're a nice size. They're, standard distance apart. I've got no significant comments one way or the other, just decent face buttons. The D-pad sits in a slightly recessed well, which I don't like. It makes it feel a bit mushier somehow than other D-pads tend to feel. It's, it clicks just fine, but the way it's positioned and the way it's almost flush to the surface, especially compared to other D-pads, it makes it feel mushier to use somehow. But, it's fine. You could probably get used to that. But yeah, I don't like that design choice either. It feels worse than the D-pad, again, on the Switch Pro controller, on the Power A controller, on even the Xbox. And, well, of course, nothing is worse than the D-pad on the PlayStation controller because that thing's awful. It's starting to feel like I'm deliberately baiting PlayStation users here, but frankly, this isn't designed for use on the PlayStation, so how many of them are going to be watching this and getting all outraged that I don't like their favorite controller? Imagine being that person, getting pissy that someone doesn't like the same controller that you do. But speaking of the PlayStation controller, that's what the shoulder triggers remind me of most. They're pretty unremarkable, but they do feel closest to the PlayStation ones, which, frankly, I'm not a huge fan of. They're a bit stiffer than, say, the Xbox ones. They don't have the same amount of travel, which means making fine adjustments throughout the range is a bit trickier. And, once more, for a controller designed around the Nintendo Switch layout, the choice to use a non-standard layout for the function buttons in the middle there, especially the screenshot button slammed back in the middle there, is a very weird choice indeed. I don't like that either. The plus and minus buttons are much lower than they should be and closer to the center, making them harder to press, especially if you've got Switch muscle memory controller built in. And the plus button in particular, every time I reach for that, I hit the thumbstick because it's too low and too far in. Whereas you can, usually it's up there. You can hit it without touching the thumbstick at all when you move your thumb up there. But that, I can't hit that plus button without knocking the thumbstick. Now, in game, that's unlikely to cause an issue. For when you're reaching for that button, you're probably not using the stick anyway. But it's still annoying. Like, it still feels like a weird design oversight. Every time I reach for that button, my thumb hits that and I get annoyed by it. It doesn't need to be like that. There's no point in doing it like that, except for having a nice little aesthetic line of 3 buttons in the middle of the controller there. That's the choice they made. They wanted it to look tidy instead of being practical. Stupid. If you make a design choice that looks nicer but is functionally worse, you've made the wrong decision. But finally, that brings us to the paddles on the back. Now, again, I'm not a huge fan of these or user of these, really. I think they're fine for the people who like to use them, but I don't tend to use them, even on the controllers that have them sort of built in. Like, again, the 8Bitdo one, you can see that has removal ones. I remove them. I don't use them. They're fine for some people, but these are fine. They fall nice at a hand, just underneath your little middle finger there. Finger. It's hard to accidentally press them, but they do have a nice light activation presence as well. So I think that's a pretty good balance as far as these ones go, as functionality goes. If you like that kind of thing, you're probably going to like the ones on this. Now, as I said in the unboxing, I do rather like the dock. I think it's quite a nice dock. I do wish it was a bit heavier because it is reasonably light. It does slide around. It does have sort of rubberized little ring on the bottom there to stop it sliding around quite so much, but it is still quite light. So every time you go to put the controller in, it moves around a little bit. But it does sit in there really, really nicely. It hones and homes itself really quite easily. It's basically impossible to put this thing down and not have it sit correctly and not have it, connect to the charging pogo pins properly. I use third-party docks for all of my other controllers. Well, actually, no, the PlayStation one is a first-party one, but, the Switch Pro and my Xbox controllers, they all have third-party docks to lesser and greater extensive usability. This is the best dock that I've ever used, I believe. It flows with the controller design really nicely, and again, just being able to throw your controller in, the controller automatically turns off as soon as it goes into the dock, it starts charging, so you get the fastest possible charge speed. It's not super fast charging. It'll still take 2 to 3 hours to charge your thing, and it does charge off USB-C input back there, which finally brings us to that little cubby hole down the bottom there again. Now, that's not just a storage spot for the receiver, which is 8Bitdo's standard receiver. If you have this plugged into here, oh, hello, reversing truck outside. Thank you for ruining my audio. How nice of you. Beep, beep, beep. So, if you have this plugged in here, shall I wait till that goes away? Let's wait till that goes away. So if you have that receiver plugged into the dock there, it's not just storage. If you then connect this to your computer's USB port, it does more than just serve as a charging port. It actually wires up that receiver to the USB. So your dock becomes your wireless receiver. So if your PC is in an awkward position under the desk or something, something that might sort of hinder the 2.4 gigahertz signal in some way, then having this sitting on your desk somewhere convenient, make sure you get a nice clean signal from it. And it also makes it easy to get to that if you need to move that to a different device instead of trying to reach around behind your computer to get it out if your computer, again, is in an inconvenient storage location. Nice design choice. One of only a few. The dock also has a pleasant soft white underglow to indicate charging, turning off when the battery is full. I quite like that. I think it looks very pretty, very subtle. Battery life is rated at up to 22 hours, so not quite as good as the Switch Pro controller itself, but significantly better than pretty much every other controller out there, especially the PlayStation 5 controller, which has atrocious battery life. All in all, I don't think Ultimate is fair branding for this. It may be the Ultimate that 8Bitdo is capable of making right now, at least at a reasonable price perhaps. But yeah, there are too many issues for this thing for me to fairly call the ultimate controller and keep a straight face. So yeah, in my view, anyone you see with universal praise for this thing or hasn't mentioned half of the things I've mentioned to you in their reviews, I'd be very, very suspicious about watching their stuff in the future because they're not very honest people, or they haven't used it for very long. They unboxed it, they used it for 5 minutes and rushed out a video to have it out in time for release day or something, or have it out in time for pre-release and pre-orders and things like that, because there are some creators who do that all the time. They just unbox something, use it for 5 minutes, and then make a review of it in order to make a deadline of some kind. For their own benefit, not for your benefit. That's not what I do. So if you haven't done yet, subscribe, because I'll always give you the truth, the honest truth, the brutal, honest truth of anything I get my hands on. And if I recommend it, you can trust in it. Just ask my regular viewers. How many of them have bought stuff based on my reviews? How many of them are still happy with their stuff? I feel confident in that number. Controller preference is, of course, highly subjective. How comfortable it is, whether or not you like the layout, whether or not you like the feature sets, whether or not you use the back pedals, all of that stuff is subjective, of course. So this is just my opinion. I mean, there are people out there in the world who legitimately claim that the PlayStation 5 controller is their very favorite, most awesome controller of all time. They think this lump of shitty D-pad having atrocious battery life, destroying the top heavy, awkward, symmetrical, too low, thumbstick mounted lump of a thing is the best controller they've ever used. That's insane to me. Those people are like furries to me. You know, I have no theoretical objection to their existence in the world, but I know I will never understand them as a people. But the 8Bitdo is a very decent third-party Nintendo Switch/PC controller. You are missing the standard features you are missing from all third-party Switch controllers, that being no NFC Amiibo support and no HD Rumble, because Nintendo doesn't share those technologies. They don't want to license them out to any other people because well, Nintendo's going to Nintendo. But it does have standard Rumble, and it does also have 6-axis motion control, which I haven't talked about in this review because it's unremarkable these days, really, to have that. And very few games use it in a useful way, really. But it is there if you care about that. But it is not everything I'd hoped it would be for something called the Ultimate. It is not a replacement for my Nintendo Switch Pro controller because it's just not as comfortable, and the layout is wrong and worse. And the analog trigger thing. I was hoping to replace this with this because I like the idea of the Hall effect sensors being supremely reliable. I like the idea of those programmable profiles coming in handy from time to time. And I like the idea of one controller being simultaneously my Switch and PC controller, because the PowerAy Fusion Pro here I almost exclusively use on my PC, especially when I'm playing things like Monster Hunter, because again, the digital triggers there make the game a lot better to use. And as I mentioned before, I'm not entirely happy with its heft or the fact that I have to give that a little wiggle from time to time to make it work properly. So I was really hoping that this would be the all-in-one solution to replace both those controllers and be better than both, but it's just not. There are only 3 things that would change that would make it a suitable replacement for those 2 controllers. Analog triggers, standard button layout for Switch. Put them in the same places they're supposed to be so they're not awkward and weird. Don't have the D-pad recessed like this, and make these things more angled so my wrists don't have to bend so much while I'm holding this controller. Again, it seems like such a tiny thing. Like even on camera, it's hard to tell. You can tell the different angles, but when they're in your hand, it feels massively different, and I don't like it. Well, I don't like it as much. It's not the most horrible controller I've ever held in my hand. It's fine. But it is only fine, not ultimate. So hopefully this has been informative and or useful to you. If it has, hopefully you've done the thing with a thumb and the comment and the button and all the stuff along the way. And thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above, whose above and beyond support I really, really do appreciate. Thank you very much helping support the channel in that way. You have purchased Pokemon for me this month. That's what I spend the Patreon money on this month, just so you know. Thank you for that. We'll be streaming it over on Twitch if you're interested in that too, of course. Thanks for watching. I'm Bloody. I will catch you next time.